Thank you. And it's exciting to be here, especially today on this 10th anniversary for the API Days conference. I think we've been to a lot of them as a company and as a team over the last few years, and it's been pretty phenomenal to see the evolution of the API industry and the API economy, and the pretty great maturation that we've gone through as an industry in that time. I always kind of say, and I refer back to an anecdote of when we started RapidAPI about 6 years ago. Whenever I would go and pitch RapidAPI to a prospective customer or to an investor, the first 3 slides would be explaining what APIs are. And it would be like this whole definition of what APIs mean and why they're important and why the future is going to be API-centric. And then especially the last couple of years, not only are people asking me to skip the slides or remove them altogether, most investors, companies, buyers that we talk to even have API specialists and API leaders in those organizations. And I think that's a really interesting sign of just how much that industry and the API space has come along. And I'm sure everyone here in the room, being API specialists, feels that too. So I'll start with a quick introduction of myself and Rapid, the company that I'm a part of. And we'll follow that up with a discussion of where we see the API economy today and where we see it going in the next 10 years of progress and innovation. So by quick introduction of myself, my name is Iddo. I'm the CEO and founder of RapidAPI. I'm a software developer myself. That's the reason why I started and got into creating developer tooling and specifically APIs. And I'm based in San Francisco. I'm also going to talk a lot about it here today, but if any of you find what we're doing here at Rapid interesting or want to talk about APIs in general, please feel free to reach out, and I would love to have a conversation about how we can drive API strategy forward together. In terms of RapidAPI, being a software developer myself, I started the company with a mission to empower developers to create transformative software. And that is a very developer-centric mission. So our approach is how can we help developers build better software and do it more quickly? And we've found over time, as I'm sure many of you have, that one of the biggest accelerants to software development is the reuse and leveraging of APIs and being able to compose APIs together into new software. So with the Rapid platform, we enable developers to do that with our public hub. So we have on rapidapi.com thousands of APIs that are available to developers. And we are today the world's largest API hub. So with Rapid, we're connecting over 4 million developers to tens of thousands of APIs and processing billions of API calls through our platform. So if any of you are building an application or in need of an API or building an API and want to monetize it and share it and sell it to millions of developers, RapidAPI is the best place to do that. We also have our Enterprise Hub platform where companies and organizations are standing up their own API hubs to empower developers internally to share and reuse existing APIs. And we're in a booth actually right outside here and happy to talk through that as well. We also have with RapidAPI our studio, which lets anyone create, develop, design APIs, and do that much more efficiently. We've recently brought that studio into VS Code as well. So if you're building your APIs and you're in Visual Studio Code, VS Code is the only kind of full-featured API studio that is, or RapidAPI for VS Code is the only full-featured API studio built into the platform, so letting you build APIs without leaving the IDE. And we have our Mac version as well. So if you're on a Mac and want the fastest, most performant solution on Mac, RapidAPI Studio for Mac is the way to go. But I'm not here to talk only about Rapid. I want to zoom back out and talk about the API economy. Obviously, we're in a conference dedicated to APIs, so me talking about APIs is not going to be a surprise. But I want to specifically focus this talk not about the technology or the standards powering APIs, but to focus it on the API economy itself, and talk about the world of APIs getting monetized and companies getting built whose only way of doing business is by providing an API to developers. As I'm sure many of us are aware, many of those companies are actually outside our doors here. The API economy, we've truly seen kind of this Cambrian explosion of API-first companies over the last decade, with entire companies coming out to offering APIs to developers and centering their business around offering APIs as the core way of doing business. We're also seeing, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the vast majority actually of internet traffic going on today is centric around APIs. So APIs are already the fundamental building blocks powering software development. And that's also why when we look at the developer tool segment, APIs and API tooling is actually the fastest growing subsegment of the API of the developer tooling industry. So APIs and offering APIs as product is actually growing at over 63% annually and is projected to outpace that growth rate in 2022. So even when the economy is slowing down, digital transformation and digital initiatives are still important, and APIs are what powers those initiatives. But more interestingly, and this is one of the things that I find personally most curious about the API industry, is it's actually powering a very fundamental paradigm shift in how business is getting done. And this is a pretty kind of bold statement to make, but I think that if we examine quickly how software engineering and software development change business and how APIs are changing software development, there's a really interesting trend that we see here where almost every company out there is kind of getting unbundled or debundled and getting divided into two different types of companies. We have the companies, kind of the B2B businesses that are providing infrastructure. So working on deeply technical problems, not just in software or cloud, but in any space, and providing infrastructure. And then you have other companies, the B2C companies, that are basically taking those tools, taking that infrastructure, connecting to it via APIs, and turning that into consumer-first companies. And I've brazenly made up a word here, but I kind of call them the B2C consumerizers. The companies taking that infrastructure and turning that into B2C solutions. Now, I think it's typical to kind of think about cloud companies as that B2B infra providers, and I think that in the first days of APIs, most APIs were centric around cloud infrastructure, but we're seeing a much broader impact of that trend today. And I want to kind of zoom out and bring out a few examples, because I think we can truly see a much more bigger industry trend around it. So I brought in a few examples of recent kind of business partnerships where you can kind of see that happening. The first one from the financial space is the Apple Card. I'm sure many of you are aware Apple recently launched their credit card. It's already become one of the most popular credit cards in the world. And every title in every newspaper was Apple is becoming a bank. Well, the reality is they didn't. Apple is not actually providing any financial services. Goldman Sachs is. Apple has just built a great consumer experience based on the Goldman Sachs infrastructure and connected to Goldman Sachs via an API. So that's a really great example of where you have Goldman Sachs as a core financial infrastructure provider, actually solving a lot of the hard problems of creating a banking and financial infrastructure, securing it, complying with regulations, doing all the security, and offering that as an API B2B service, and then a consumerizer company like Apple turning that into a very delightful consumer experience. Another example from the financial space is, I'm sure many here are familiar with Robinhood. The new stock trading application become super popular over the last few years. But again, Robinhood is not really a financial services company. They use services like Citadels and other to actually do a lot of the stock trading and the stock holding. And that's what enabled them to get started pretty quickly for a stock brokerage. Another example, I'm sure many was more popular early in the pandemic, but that many people are familiar with Clubhouse, right? They provided this great experience around being able to set up live clubhouses and talk to influencers and have really interesting conversations. Only they didn't want to have to go and deal with a lot of the infrastructure of actually doing live audio encryption and coding and decoding and empowering audio infrastructure. So they used the API Agora to drive that. So another example of infrastructure provider and then consumerizer of that infrastructure. Another example I have is TripAction and virtually any travel booking website using companies like Amadeus and Sabre and others that provide the travel booking infrastructure. And another example, we've seen that become really popular recently. Companies that are creating CRM and email and other productivity tooling that's powered by AI, only they don't actually provide the AI infrastructure, but rather use APIs offered by OpenAI. And many people recently have been talking about GPT-3 and DALL-E and a lot of the generative AI trends that have been going on. All of those are API driven. You get research companies like OpenAI creating great technology, investing a lot of research dollars into it, and offering those as APIs, and then awesome applications using those APIs to create delightful consumer experiences. So the overall kind of trend that has been powering the API economy has been kind of this bifurcation of the industry, where you got companies that take the deeply technical problems, create infrastructure around them, and provide that infrastructure as a B2B API, and then other companies, those B2C consumerizers, that take those deep infrastructure APIs and turn them into consumer-first applications. And we've seen that in the early days of the API industry, mostly with cloud in kind of core cloud infrastructure services. But this is now is becoming a trend that is much more broad and is affecting every industry. So when you look at finance, you look at it within finance, banking and insurance, you look at telco, you look at data sets and travel. In almost every industry, you have those consumerizers and the infra providers working together to create solutions. So looking at kind of the next 10 years of the API economy, I think an interesting topic to discuss here is what's next. And I want to use this opportunity to highlight 3 trends that we at Rapid have been looking at as it relates to the API economy. The first one, and this should not be a surprising trend for me to highlight here, we see every company becoming an API company. And with that trend that we've talked about, and I'll talk about these more in a second, but with the trend that we've seen of kind of that bifurcation of the market between B2B API providers and API consumerizers, every company is going to be on one side or another of that trend. So either providing APIs or consuming APIs to create an application. So every company will become an API company. The second trend that we've been tracking pretty closely is companies creating more APIs for more reasons, and we're seeing a big diversifications in the drivers for a company to create APIs, and I'll talk about some of those drivers in a second. The third trend that I want to highlight here is how successful companies will be the ones that are investing more in the API stack and are actually thinking more about API tooling and how it enables them to create more APIs and participate more thoughtfully in the API economy. And again, I'll provide more details on that. But diving into the first trend here, I want to talk about how every company is becoming an API company. For most of the first kind of 10, 15 years of the API economy, most API companies or most legacy companies did not actually participate that much in the API space. And if you look back or think back to that slide that I showed earlier, so looking back at some of those larger API companies or the companies kind of dominating the revenue in the API industry, most of these are tech-native companies that got funded or got created to create an API. So these were established for the most part as API-first companies, right? Like Twilio, Stripe, SendGrid, like those are API companies. That's what they do. And they're kind of tech startup that came to create an API. And in a lot of those cases, what those APIs are doing is actually abstracting away existing companies that exist in the marketplace. So, and this sounds kind of weird, so I'll give an example or a couple of examples of what that looks like. You know, one instance is in the telco space. You have a lot of the existing infrastructure companies in the telco space, right? So you have the classic suspects, and these are just some examples that I have here. The Deutsche Telekoms and AT&Ts and Vodafones and Verizons of the world that actually own the telco space and own the infrastructure and the wires and the physical infrastructure delivering text messages, phone calls, phone numbers, etc. But then those, from a programmatic perspective, those companies did not have compelling APIs for a long time that are accessible to developers and empower developers to go and create software on top of them. So what happened? A new startup came along, a company like Twilio that actually connected to that infrastructure. Twilio doesn't own any wires, antennas, or any of the physical infrastructure. They rely on the existing companies in the space, but go and provide a new API that is compelling to developers on top of that. Another space where that happened is the banking industry, where again, you had the actual physical banks that exist in the world are established, comply with regulation, are being regulated, and actually provide banking solutions to customers. But then for a lot of companies that wanted to integrate with those banks or provide solutions on top of them, there was not an easy, compelling API to connect to. So a company like Plaid came along to actually go and develop an API on top of those solutions, or on top of those banks and those players, and create the developer-first API. So what we kind of get here is that two-layered economy where you have the actual legacy infrastructure providers, and I call them legacy here, I try to not mean that as a bad term, but the companies that actually went and did all the hard work to actually create the infrastructure. But then you have what I kind of call the API startup, so the tech companies swooping in, creating a compelling developer-first API on top of them, and becoming tremendously successful with that. And when you look at a lot of these companies, these are suddenly companies that are making 80% plus margin profits on top of that existing infrastructure. And I think that now, as we've kind of seen the API economy maturing, is when a lot of people are starting to get kind of angry, like, why are we letting some of these newer players come in, create a nice API on top of our system, and then slap an 80% profit margin on top of that. And this kind of realization or this conclusion is what's driving a lot of legacy businesses to realize, hey, we can actually be the ones, if we just do the right steps, which is become API-first companies and develop great developer-centric APIs, we can be the ones to own that API. We can cut out the intermediary and actually participate in the API economy. And this is why, and this is some numbers from our most recent developer survey, but we're seeing more developers, especially ones working in the enterprise, investing a bigger share of their time in actually building partner-facing APIs. And that notion of partner and customer-facing APIs is becoming a lot more important for businesses and companies as they kind of think about the next 10 years of their business. So that is all kind of one trend that we've been seeing of why every company will become an API company. And I think that over time, even when we go beyond telco and finance, and these are just two examples I brought here, other industries like travel, other industries like manufacturing and supply chain, and other industries like healthcare will all start seeing legacy companies that have a lot of very valuable infrastructure investing more in APIizing that infrastructure and exposing it to developers. The second trend that I want to dive into here is companies are creating more APIs for more reasons. And we kind of talked in the last few minutes, I talked about developing APIs to capture a profit margin or to drive direct revenue. That is one great reason to develop an API. But there are a few other drivers that companies are now realizing for why they need to create more APIs. And in Rapid, we've kind of been tracking that trend and categorizing it into 5 main drivers that companies are now identifying to create APIs. So the first one, and this is the one that I kind of touched on since the beginning of this presentation, is direct revenue. So generating an API to bring a new revenue stream into the company. That is, I don't think that one requires too much explanation. That is, when you go and develop APIs to drive telco revenue, to drive banking revenue, to drive more sales for your product through an API channel. So that's, the pretty classic reason to go and create a new API. But, I think the bigger realization is the other 4 that are coming on top of that. So the next one we're seeing is data collection, and companies realizing more and more that by creating APIs and getting companies to integrate with those APIs, even if those APIs are free, the data received by the companies through the consumption of those APIs is becoming immensely more valuable. Not to be cliche here, but data is becoming the new oil or the new gold, and companies are realizing that by getting other companies to build consumer experiences on top of their APIs, they can collect a tremendous amount of data through those APIs. So we're seeing a lot of APIs being created there. The third one is product stickiness. So companies realizing, hey, if we create an API and we provide that API to our customers and they integrate with that API, that creates a whole wealth of integrations around our product, which makes it really hard to switch away from our product later. So we should encourage our customers to create more API integrations, and those API integrations will make it harder for them to switch off of our product later, so make our product stickier. Another one is product extension, so enabling startups to cater to new segments, cater to new industries, and basically make their product extensible and create a marketplace of those extension around their business. And we've seen that becoming really popular with a lot, especially of B2B tooling in the last few years. And then the last one is product relevancy. So for products that might still have a tremendous amount of data or market effects or network effect lock-in for themselves, but maybe falling behind in terms of relevancy, becoming an API provider can actually keep that product top of mind. I mean, one good example that I've been using for a few years in explaining that is Facebook. Not a lot of people have been using Facebook recently, or the level of usage for the core Facebook product has been dropping. But what Facebook did a few years ago, now called Meta, that has been really smart, is actually create an authentication and friend graph API. And a lot of social applications have been building themselves on top of Facebook. So I remember even before Instagram got acquired by Facebook, the entire Instagram application, the way you logged in, authenticated, and then was able to find your friends is through the Facebook API. And this is why even when Facebook, this kind of also plays into data collection and product expansion and a number of other drivers, but even as Facebook was kind of dropping in popularity and in relevancy, because of their APIs, Facebook as a business was able to remain very powerful. So to kind of sum up that second big trend that we're seeing, companies are exposing more APIs for more reasons, and it's kind of going beyond just driving revenue. And I say just driving revenue, that's not to downplay it. Driving revenue is obviously one of the most critical things in a company, but we also see trends that relate to driving continuous innovation for the business and actually guaranteeing the future relevancy of that business too. And APIs play a critical role into that. So I talked about why legacy companies are now prioritizing becoming API-first businesses to kind of catch up with the new API startups, and also why there are more reasons to drive APIs. The third and last trend I want to talk about here is why companies that are successful in that industry are the ones that are actually now investing more in the API stack and are actually being more thoughtful about the tooling that's driving API creation and investing the level of money and effort in actually integrating those tools into their ecosystems. This is a quote from one of the Gartner's report, and I know that we had a lot of kind of Gartner talk throughout the beginning of this day, but 80% of organizations will have advanced API strategies by 2025, and I think that that's a fact, and we're kind of realizing that to be able to be successful, you need APIs. That was kind of like what the last 2 points have been about, and to be able to have APIs successfully, the right strategy and the right tooling needs to be in place. As we think about the API stack, I think that previously and historically, companies have had a bit of a narrow view into what the API stack is and what the API stack means. We view the API stack more holistically now and really focusing around the 3 core personas that API stack needs to serve. The first persona that we think about with the API stack is the API builder. So the person actually going to build and create the API. And I think that might be the most obvious one. Whenever we think about stack, it's from a development perspective. But for a very long time, that's been the only persona and the only type of user actually catered to by the API stack. So that's the trivial one, but we're now seeing an expansion of who is catered to by the API stack to also being a lot more thoughtful about the API consumers. So both the internal people in the company consuming private APIs, but also the external third parties, customers, and partners consuming the API. And then also the administrator and security individuals going to govern and create observability around those API platforms. And when we talk at Rapid about modern API stacks and modern API strategies, it's really ones that actually cater to all 3 of those personas and are able to offer the right solution to all 3 personas that interact and think about APIs in the organization. Within the API stack, we identified a few key steps that right API platform has to cater to. With API builders, it's basically the entire API development lifecycle. So going from designing and speccing out APIs through building and deploying them, testing and monitoring them, publishing them, monitoring them, and analyzing the actual adoption and usage of those APIs. So the right API stack will consider and think through through the API builder journey throughout that entire process. From an API consumer perspective, it's going from starting at the very beginning, at the discovery of those APIs, into the evaluation of APIs, so thinking through playground and documentation experience, into the integration, so supporting with tutorials, guides, and code snippets, and then all the way to actually being able to monitor those APIs. And from talking to users of APIs and the consumer personas, that monitoring side is becoming more and more important with actually being able to have self-service debug and analytics around what the APIs are. And then lastly, the API admin, thinking through being able to set standards, both from a quality and style guides, review APIs and understand compliance with those standards, and then observe and govern the security and performance of those APIs on an ongoing basis. And this is not a simple task because the unique thing about APIs is to do observability right and to do governance right requires a combination of both the build time and design data, so the schemas and static information about the APIs, but also mixing that with the runtime logs and analytics to actually understand how those APIs are being consumed. So there is a lot, I know that this is a big slide, there is a lot to be done around building a good, proper, modern API stack, but it actually takes all of these components to be successful and empower companies to create better APIs and capture the benefits of the API economy, which, as I kind of introduced in the beginning of this talk, is growing very rapidly these days. So I want to thank everyone for joining the talk. I hope these kind of 3 trends resonate with everyone in the crowd here, and that, at least we provide a helpful framework for thinking about the next 10 years of APIs. I hope to be back here in 10 years and either be proven right about these trends or very, very wrong. That remains to be seen. But in the meantime, if this resonates with anyone here, if you want to continue talking about actually creating API hubs and creating and modernizing API stacks in your companies, we're happy to have those conversations. We're going to be, again, in a booth right outside this auditorium. But also, we are sponsoring a special tour of the museum tonight. It's at 6 p.m., so in about 30 minutes. And we'd love to see all of you there, get to see this beautiful museum, and also hopefully talk about APIs in the process. Thank you very much.